Hi everyone, my name is Thandiwe Muriu and this is my channel. We're currently going through a series of photography basics for beginners, and continuing that series, today I want to talk about the different exposure modes on your camera. So before I even begin to talk about the different exposure modes in your camera, I first need to talk about metering and what that is. In the olden days, when photographers wanted to take a picture and they wanted to make sure it's correctly exposed, that is, not too bright and not too dark, they used to use what's called a light meter. And they take that device and put it next to their model, and it would read the light around the subject to tell them what settings they should put in their camera. But today, because of technology, you actually have a light meter built into your camera. If you look through the viewfinder, you can actually see your meter or on the top display of your camera. And it's a bar with an indicator, and it goes from 0 to positive or 0 to negative. And that indicates whether your image is overexposed, that is, the indicator will be more on the side with the plus, or if it's underexposed, that is, your indicator will be more on the side with the minus sign. The light meter will determine whether your image is over or underexposed using the principles of the exposure triangle. If you want to know more about the exposure triangle, you can go to this video and hear me speak about the different elements in the triangle. But really quick, that's your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. So coming back to exposure modes, there's several options, mainly four, that your camera gives you when it comes to using the exposure triangle to your benefit or to achieve the effect you want. And of course, all of this is based off of what it's reading on its meter, which just reads the light and the shadows and the highlights in the scene before the lens. So the first camera mode is shutter priority. If you use a Nikon camera, the shutter priority mode is indicated by an S on the dial. If you use a Canon camera, it's indicated by TV. And in this mode, what you're telling the camera is, you make all the decisions about my ISO and my aperture, but I want to make the decision on how fast or slow my shutter speed should be. So if I decide my shutter speed should be 200th of a second, that is 1/200, the camera using its meter will measure the light and say, what does your ISO need to be and what does your aperture need to be so that the image is not too bright or too dark. When do I use the shutter priority mode? If you're a sports photographer or you're shooting fast-paced action and you know your priority is to freeze motion or to show motion, then you'd set the shutter speed so that you know every single shot you take, your subject will be frozen in the correct way that you want. And then you let the camera make all the other decisions because those are not priorities to you. The same can be applied if you want to blur motion. So you could decide, I want a really low shutter speed so that the water that I'm shooting in the river that's passing in front of my scene is blurred. And you'd set the slow shutter speed, so maybe 1/10 of a second, and the camera would decide what aperture and what ISO you need to use to make sure the image is not too bright, which is a risk when you're shooting at slower shutter speeds. The next mode is the aperture priority mode, which is indicated by A on your camera if you use a Nikon or AV on your camera if you shoot Canon. And here what you're telling the camera is, I want to make all the decisions about my aperture, which relates again to your depth of field. If you want to know more about depth of field, you can click on this link to a video where I talk about it. So you tell the camera, I'm in charge of the aperture and by extension the depth of field, but you make all the decisions about my shutter speed and my ISO. So there, let's say I'm shooting a flower and I want the background to be blurred. I would set my aperture to maybe 1.8, f1.8, and the camera will then decide my shutter speed maybe needs to be a lot faster because with such a wide open aperture, there's a lot of light hitting the sensor, and the meter will say, if the image shutter speed that we choose is, I don't know, 200th of a second, then the image will be too bright. So maybe you need to be up at a 4,000th of a second, so 1/4000. But you make all the decisions about your f-stop, and then the camera adjusts your shutter speed and your ISO accordingly. The next mode is manual mode, which is where I use my camera almost 100% of the time. I never use the other modes. And here you tell the camera, I want to make all the decisions about my ISO, about my aperture, and about my shutter speed. So you have full control. Why I prefer this mode is because I'm fully in control of my depth of field. I'm fully in control of noise in my image, which I mentioned in the exposure triangle video. And I'm fully in control of motion, whether it needs to be frozen or it needs to be blurred. After shooting for several years, I actually find it faster to use manual mode than any of the other exposure modes on my camera. And that's just because I've memorized where the dials are and I know I can respond very quickly if the lighting situation changes. Let's say, for example, if I was in aperture priority mode and I chose to shoot at f1.8, which is really, really wide open, and the light changes so that maybe we were shooting in cloud and then suddenly the sun comes out from behind the cloud, you'll have the problem of your image becoming significantly more bright. And sometimes your camera can struggle to choose a correct exposure fast enough. So when I shoot manual mode, I immediately know maybe I need to change my f-stop or maybe I need to change my shutter speed, and I can make that change really quick without relying on the camera, which may or may not get it right. This is especially true in low light situations. Cameras in general just don't do well when it comes to really dark situations. So in manual mode, I can make those changes without the camera getting confused or having to hope the camera gets it right. Also in manual mode, you'll be deciding your white balance, you'll be deciding whether or not to use your flash, how powerful your flash should be. Basically, all the decisions related to taking the picture are up to you. The fourth mode that most cameras have is called program mode, both on Nikon and on Canon. It's denoted by a P on the exposure mode dial. And in this mode, you tell the camera that you make the decision about the shutter speed and the aperture I should use, and it makes that decision based on the information that it receives from its meter. But program mode allows you to then change the settings of both of them to get the same exposure but with different settings. So let me explain that. Let's say you put your camera on program mode and it says this scene should be exposed at f2.8 with a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. And you don't want the picture to have such a shallow depth of field, so you want your f-stop to be higher. So you'll then go and change your aperture and say, actually, I want you to shoot this scene at f8. And what it will do is, it will give the same exposure, but with different settings. So your f2.8 will become f8, and your 1/4000th of a second may go down and become maybe 1/200th of a second, because you need to make the image brighter, since by increasing the f-stop, you've made it darker. So the camera will do all these calculations for you, but you're allowed to change the exposures because it doesn't lock down only one choice of settings for you. That's the nice thing about P mode. In comparison, there's auto mode, where you tell the camera, I don't want to make any decisions about this picture, just you decide what my settings should be, and whatever you pick, I'll be okay with. And there it will decide your white balance, it will decide your ISO, it will decide your aperture, it will decide your shutter speed, and it will also decide whether or not the pop-up flash, which is a small flash on top of your camera, should pop up or it should stay down. If you're shooting in program mode, the camera will not automatically fire your pop-up flash if it feels you need it. So that's another difference between auto mode and program mode. Depending on the make and the model of your camera, so Nikon, Canon, Pentax, Sony, and what model it is in the cameras they offer, it may actually give you the option of putting in your own exposure modes. And on Nikon cameras, this is shown by the symbol U1 and U2. And on Canon cameras, it's C1, C2, or C3, depending again on what camera you have. And here you can record presets and save them and use them whenever you like. Just the same way you'd use manual or program or auto exposure modes. Again, depending on the camera make and model that you have, manufacturers can put in some pre-selected modes. And these could include sport mode, no flash mode, macro mode, landscape mode, and I quickly just want to discuss these and which mode is ideal for the situation that you're shooting in. So let's begin with sport mode. Here, the manufacturers know that you'll be shooting fast-paced action, so the priority is to have a very fast shutter speed to freeze motion. So therefore, your aperture would be low. Usually in sport mode, the camera will also disable your flash, so your flash won't fire, because your camera has a maximum sync speed. That is the maximum speed the shutter speed can be at for the flash to fire. And I'll do a video explaining that a bit later on. But for now, all you need to know is that in sport mode, your flash won't fire. In macro mode, manufacturers know that you'll be shooting a very small part of an object or a subject. And the priority in this mode for the camera is to make your aperture as wide as possible so that you have a very shallow depth of field. So your camera may automatically put in an f-stop of f2.8 or f1.8 or maybe even f1.2 if your lens goes down that low. And macro mode is ideal when you want to shoot a really close-up of something. So if you want to shoot wedding rings, or if you want to shoot an insect on a leaf, or you want to shoot a raindrop, then macro mode is designed for those kind of situations. Landscape mode, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. Manufacturers know that you're going to be shooting a very wide scene and you want both the foreground and the background to be in focus. So the camera will give you a very small f-stop, f11, f14, maybe even f22, because the priority is to keep as much of the scene in front of the camera in focus as possible. So if you're shooting a large group portrait, maybe you could consider using the landscape mode, because you want everyone again in the front row of the picture to be as much in focus as the people 3 or 4 rows behind in the picture. In night mode, manufacturers know that you're going to be shooting in a low light situation, so the priority is to make the picture as bright as possible. In this case, your camera may automatically make your ISO go higher, so the sensor is more sensitive to the light in the scene. It may also keep your f-stop low, again to let as much light as possible enter that big hole in your lens. And thirdly, it may slow down the shutter speed so that both your subject and your background are equally exposed. In night mode, most probably your flash is going to fire, so the pop-up flash on top of your camera will pop up and fire when you take a picture. One thing to note about this mode is because it makes the shutter speed so slow, you need to have a very steady hand when you're holding the camera, or you need to put your camera on a tripod to make sure that you don't get blurry pictures from camera shake. Depending on the camera you have, some have a no flash mode. So this works exactly like auto, except for that your flash does not fire. And this may be ideal in situations where you're shooting through glass. So let's say I'm shooting a picture behind a glass picture frame, and if my flash fires, it will reflect back onto the camera, and in the picture all you'll see is maybe the wooden frame and the flash reflected back. So if you switch off your flash, it allows the light to travel through the glass and actually show the picture behind the glass. Another situation where you may want to use no flash mode is in Catholic churches and other religious institutions. I have previously shot in churches where they don't let you use your flash because they feel like it distracts people from the worship or the ceremony that's going on. And there you want to, by using no flash mode, you know 100% that your flash will not fire and interfere with the proceedings going on. As a recap, one of the questions you may have is, what's the difference between these special modes, that is the sport mode, the macro mode, the portrait mode, etc., and the 4 basic modes I began with, which was your program mode, your shutter priority, your aperture priority, and your manual mode. In the 4 modes I mentioned, you're dealing purely with the shutter speed as well as the aperture when you're trying to meter the scene correctly. In the specialized modes, the camera is deciding more than that. It's deciding your ISO, it's deciding your white balance, it's deciding whether your flash fires or not. So they're all like auto mode, just designed for more specific situations. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about the exposure modes on your camera or about the meter in your camera, please put them in the comment section below so we can get a conversation going. If this is your first time watching the channel, thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button to get more videos from our beginner series every Monday and Thursday. If it's not your first time, thank you for being so awesome and allowing me to be a part of your journey. Any gear that I mentioned in this video is listed in the description box below so you know where to get it. If you want to interact with me on social media, you can find me on Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and off my website, www.thandiwe.com. Again, I provided links to all of those in the description box below, which is right under the like button. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. That's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.